Welcome back. We are working through our series called Thriving in Community. We're on part 3, which is about group identity. And believe it or not, this is episode 13.
Wow.
So maybe we can just review what group identity is. Those are character traits that are modeled by Jesus that a group of Jesus followers, that's his church, that's us, should emulate ourselves and for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that comes down to our group. That's us as either small groups or friends or even the whole church community understands what that is, the traits that Jesus modeled, and we practice living that way. So we ask ourselves, we are a people who, and we fill in the blanks. So what have we talked about so far?
Well, we started off with just talking about reading the Bible regularly, simply because if we're going to be like Jesus, that is one of the most wonderful tools we could have to knowing who he was. And so that helps us to lead into all the rest that we're going to talk about here. And so we've covered compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience, generosity, loving our enemies, offering forgiveness, making peace, and practicing prayer and solitude.
The list is getting quite long there.
It is.
And if you missed any of those are available on our YouTube channel.
That's right.
On this YouTube channel, and you can listen or watch those at your leisure. So today we're going to consider the group identity trait of grace.
All right. What is it?
So what is it? How do we describe? Well, we're going to describe it, I think, using Bible words. So in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word that's often translated as grace is kanun. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Whose root word is ken. I think you're supposed to gargle a little when you say that one.
Yeah. K-H-E-N, not
yes.
Ken as in Barbie.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Makes me want a beach.
We're here all night with the jokes.
Yes. So the Hebrew word kanun means to show favor or to request favor. So an example of that would be in the book of Esther, where if you remember how the story goes, Queen Esther goes to the king and asks for a favor to save her and her people, and the king shows her favor. So we're seeing both sides of the coin there, and he shows her favor and grants a request. Now, if we just to get a better understanding of what this word means, and I mean, quite often we hear the word grace and we think we know what it means, but I think it's interesting to explore some of these nuances of the word. So the word chen is either it sort of can lean towards elegant or charming or inducing a response that is favorable. So in one of the Psalms, the poet is described as having lips of chen. So his words induce a favorable response.
Okay.
Can also be applied to things like a gemstone in a ring or a necklace, which is said to bring favor to your hand or to your neck because of its beauty.
Okay.
And then if we look at how the word is used, about 2/3 of the time when it's used in the Old Testament, it's used to describe God as an attribute of God.
Okay. And then it's linked to grace, but it's also grace linked to other things we've talked about, traits like compassion and generosity.
Yeah, so there's where I think it's important to really keep that in mind as we talk through this today, that grace in and of itself is more of a condition or a motivation of some of the other identities.
And it seems to like as we've gone through these identities, like none of these identities are like, well, like kind of like we'll say in of themselves, kind of isolated. They really blend into each other.
Sure.
Like even going back to, we talked about just recently with compassion linked to grace. Compassion is the motivation to kindness,
right,
and things like that. And so they really are, a lot of them. Just there's no great thick border. There's a lot of sort of like the blending in together and stuff like that.
Exactly. So
which makes it a lot of sense, like the idea of these understanding these identity and why we kind of need them all. It's not a buffet where you pick and choose which identities. It's like, no, these feed into each other and become more and more
it's all part of
what Jesus and who Jesus was because they're kind of come together. It's a package deal.
Sure. So The big idea here is that God shows favor even when people are undeserving of it. So when the people of Israel break their covenant with God almost immediately after making it, I mean, God gives them the 10 Commandments. The first 2 are about not worshiping idols and worshiping only God. And within a few hours, it seems like they're worshiping a golden calf.
Yeah.
Now,
It happened fast.
it did. So Moses intercedes for them, and God shows favor to them by keeping his part of the covenant and being present with them as they travel to the promised land, even though they don't really deserve that. Then we move over to the New Testament, and the words that are often translated as grace are alio, which is to show mercy, oik, I love these Greek words, oiktiro, which is to show compassion, or charis, which means gracious gift. So a lot of times all of those words are translated as grace, so they each have sort of different nuances of what we've been talking about. And again, if we look at the life of Jesus, all of these are embodied in his life and teachings. So we're looking at a few examples now of Jesus showing grace or undeserved favor. So very familiar story. We've talked about it a few times. In John chapter 8 is the woman caught in adultery.
Yeah, and I think this is it's also an interesting story because it's these Jewish leaders, these religious leaders, bringing out this woman who's caught in the act of adultery, and they're coming ready, stone in hand, and meet with Jesus, and they're ready to go, and basically challenging him and like, hey, what should we do with her? And according to the law, both the man and the woman.
Where's the man?
Yeah. Are to be put to death by throwing stones at them. And that was there. There's that letter of the law. And obviously, they're not even holding the letter of the law at that point.
Yeah. Even by Jesus' time, they weren't really enforcing this law. So
this was really not about the woman at all at this point.
They're trying to discredit Jesus by creating a no-win scenario.
She's just a victim in this.
She's a victim, yeah. So if Jesus says stone the woman, then he's not compassionate.
That's right.
And if he says let her go, then he has no regard for the law of Moses.
Well, that's just it. And that's just it. A lot of his followers will struggle with him. Yeah. If he was to, hey, throw this, or if he says no, then they get to have their aha moment.
Love how Jesus responds to this, though. He sees right through their deception, and in verse 7 says, "Let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone." And eventually, they all stand around looking at each other, and they all leave, and the woman's still standing there with Jesus.
Well, it makes you wonder if one of those was the guy, or if they have been the guy.
Exactly.
And they're like, hey,
how would they know?
Yes, exactly.
So again, we've talked about this before. Jesus shows her compassion and kindness by offering her grace. She doesn't deserve it, but again in verse 10, he asked the woman, or he asked actually in verse 9, where is anybody left to accuse you? And she goes, no, master, there isn't anybody. He goes, well, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. So Jesus is offering her grace by, again, he's saying that she doesn't have to pay the penalty for what, or the consequences of her actions in that moment, according to the law. He's offering her grace, but he's also cautioning her that continuing down this road will lead to further consequences.
Yeah, and I think it is really important to see the grace in that. It's the go and sin no more. It's the I have nothing against you either. It's the acknowledgement of yes, something was done wrong.
Yeah,
and I think sometimes we forget that it's grace isn't somehow kind of going back to forgiveness too. It's not about not acknowledging the wrong that was done.
Exactly. And
sometimes we do make that. Well, grace doesn't mean we don't face the wrong that we done, or doesn't brought up. No, it needs to be brought up. But and then it's the whole idea. Okay, but I'm not gonna hold this against you.
And then if we look at another example, I mean, Jesus' whole mission, I guess, his birth, death, and resurrection, is all about grace. In describing Jesus' mission to the church in Corinth, the Apostle Paul says in 2 Corinthians 8:9, "For you know the grace," and the word here is charis, so it's a gift of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. So Jesus came from heaven and became a human, so humanity could have a restored relationship with God through his death and resurrection. Even though, because of our fallen nature, we don't deserve it.
Yeah. And again, I think it's, one of the things we talk a fair amount about, I think, just Christianity in general, is this idea of a works. We are not a works based. Mm-hmm. There's nothing we can boast in what we did. We're as good as we think we can be, and maybe legitimately can be.
Yep.
It's never gonna be worthy of this gift.
Yes.
And I think it's such an important thing. That's why grace is such an important aspect of Jesus. And then also when we need to portray that same grace, it's just like, hey, he did this thing. Why are we not doing it as well?
Yeah, exactly. So we've received grace. We should in turn show grace. So one last example from Jesus, and I really like this one. It's after Jesus' resurrection, and it's the restoration of Peter. And I think you actually preached on this Easter time a year or two ago.
Yep.
And so this story starts off with Jesus has appeared to his disciples several times after his resurrection, according to the different accounts in the four Gospels and Acts. Mm-hmm. And John records an account of Jesus meeting with 7 of the disciples by the Sea of Galilee sometime after his and 2 initial appearances to them earlier in the week.
Yeah.
And Peter decides to go fishing, and 7 of the disciples decide to go with him. So, Jesus has called him. This is reminiscent of a story when Peter was called to be a disciple of Jesus, and Jesus calls him to fish for men, which is a metaphor for preaching and teaching the good news of Jesus and the kingdom of heaven. So even though Peter has been a disciple of Jesus for 3 years, he's seen Jesus die and been resurrected, he still decides to go fishing for fish. And to me, it just seems like a step backwards, and I really don't know what prompted it. It doesn't say.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things we can get on it. Like it's when, I mean, how often? I mean, we probably all done it to a degree, where something bad happens and you kind of just go back to what you know.
Yeah, exactly. Or things don't turn out the way we expect them if we took a risk. So we go back to what we know. Yeah. So the 7 disciples fish all night and they catch nothing. And here we get a real sense of deja vu, similar to the first time when Jesus called them. They're coming back into shore, and Jesus is on shore, and he calls out to them, "Hey, have you got any fish?" And they replied, "No." So Jesus tells them to throw the net out on specifically the right-hand side of the boat. And just like before, they catch a great number of fish. And by this time, they realize it's Jesus that's telling them this. And when they get to shore, Jesus is there with breakfast ready. And it says very specifically in verse 9, it says the fish were cooking over a charcoal fire, and there was some bread as well. Now, I know I mentioned you had preached on this.
Yeah.
So what's the significance of the charcoal fire?
Well, it's because it's only actually mentioned from my memory twice.
Yeah.
In all of John's gospel. The first time, and it's specific, it's not just a fire. That's why I think it's really important. It's really giving the description of charcoal fire. And that's when Peter would deny Jesus. Jesus is arrested, going to be crucified, and he denies him 3 times. When John is setting up that scene, it's by a charcoal fire.
Charcoal fire.
And so here we are again, where he sets a scene. And again, he could have said, "Hey, they were having fish by the fire. They were cooking fish." Yeah. But it's the charcoal fire again that just is very obviously, at least from my understanding and how I read it, how I know I definitely read in different commentaries. Like this is a take note moment.
Yeah,
it's reminiscent. Here we're a charcoal fire again. It's to call back to that moment.
So the charcoal fire is a reminder of Peter's shame of that night.
That's right.
So. But Jesus is sitting around the fire and talking to Peter after breakfast. And then he starts into these questions of, "Peter, do you love me?" To which Peter replies that he does. And Jesus responds with, "Feed my lambs." And then Jesus repeats it 2 more times to the point where Peter's getting a little frustrated. And And I'm thinking, what does this really mean? And to me, if in understanding this, like you say, from some commentaries and things that we've talked about before, Jesus is actually restoring Peter to his calling to be an apostle and to be preaching and teaching the good news of Jesus and the kingdom of heaven. So it's a whole restoration process. He's gently reminding Peter of what happened, and he's saying, I'm not going to leave you there, and I'm not going to let you go back to being just fishermen fishing for fish for a living. I called you to be my disciple, and that still stands.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note like why this. I think this story definitely shows it, but it is the idea that when God practices grace, it's a transformation agent.
Yep.
It's not just sort of like a get out of jail free card and now just keep doing whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
Because I mean, he says, as we talked about in John 8, like it's go and sin no more.
Yep.
John 4 with the woman at the well, kind of like it was, there's a go and sin no more kind of idea. It's a transformation agent. It's not meant to just sort of like, I can feel better about myself and continue doing or anything and that is something we need to really see. It's really important. It is a transformation.
Yeah. And again, Peter doesn't deserve it.
Nope.
He's actually denied Jesus, and he's gone back to his old way of life, and yet Jesus just doesn't leave him there. He reminds him of his calling and restores him to that. So,
and I think it's really important as you tell, and kind of going back to that sermon a couple of years ago, like we see Peter, like, I mean, you almost wonder if that didn't happen, if Peter would have been stuck there.
Yeah.
And again, going back to transformation, it propelled him forward into that identity that Jesus had for him.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, as you said at the top of this, we have been shown grace by God and Jesus. So as followers of Jesus, we are a people who show others grace or undeserved favor.
Yeah.
So let's talk a few minutes about how we put that into practice. So I think grace, like many of the other character traits we've talked about, go hand in hand and work together. For example, someone may show someone grace by being compassionate and kind, or even by forgiving them. And the whole point of grace is that we offer it whether the person receiving it deserves it or not. Mm-hmm. So, we can go to the extreme case, like we talked about in a podcast a couple of weeks ago. In one of our Sunday messages, is the extreme case of loving your enemy.
Yeah.
So obviously, because they're an enemy, and again, we define what an enemy is in our culture. It isn't the same as when it was in Jesus' time, but they don't deserve our grace. So they've probably hurt us or offended us in some way. So it can be extremely difficult to show them grace by going to the action of being kind or forgiving. And again, as we've said all along, you can't always get there in one giant step. Sometimes we need to start out with what I call them baby steps. Maybe just the only thing you can really do for them is start praying for them, because you at this point, you may not be able to show them kindness or forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And then once you've started praying for them, again, the Holy Spirit does cause transformation, I believe, and we can work up to just even like stop ignoring or avoiding them, and then getting to the point where we can be kind and forgiving.
Yeah, and it is important this might take time, and it might look different depending upon situations.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I wouldn't want anyone to again make this the bad choice, like when we guessed we need to show grace, but again, like it just where we could take that to the extreme, and it's sort of like, oh no, that was where it could be something that's unsafe.
Sure, and and thanks for bringing that up. I think it's important. We've said it before, and we'll continue to say it. We're not to allow ourselves to be victims.
Yes.
And we may have to set up boundaries, and we may have to check in every once in a while to see if the boundary is still necessary. But again, we don't want to put ourselves in the position of being a victim by taking grace to the extreme. But in my thought process, when I was thinking about this, I like us to consider a much less extreme case. Have you ever known people who keep track of favors?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, so they do a favor for you, and then they expect you to do a favor for them in return. Even if it's just inviting them to dinner to your house. So if I invite you for dinner and then you expect me to invite you for dinner, and you won't invite me again until I invite you, that's keeping track of favors.
Yeah, it's almost taking a social decorum of some sort,
Yeah.
and taking it to, again, probably an element of an extreme, but yeah, a gift giving, just like,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, you got me a gift and it cost $50, I must get you a gift and
It costs
$50.
Exactly. So in the end, everybody comes out even, I guess, but to me, there's no real favor shown there.
Well, not grace.
No, definitely not grace. Yeah.
It's sort of, it's earned. It's quid pro pro. Did I say that right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So, and I've actually seen people that have lost friendships because they expected a favor in return, and when it didn't come, they refuse to show any grace or any favor at all anymore. And I've seen this. I mean, this is the theme of TV shows I've seen, where I'll help you, but sometime in the future I'll ask for you to give me a favor in return. Or sometimes it's played for great comedy.
Yep.
I know in I think it's White Christmas, Danny Kaye's always rubbing his arm every time he wants something from the other character, reminding him of how he took shrapnel for him in the war, kind of thing. And so and I actually saw it in a TV show recently this week to the same idea. It's played for comedic effect.
Yeah.
I saved your life, so you need to, no matter how many favors you do for me, it'll never make up for that big favor I did for you. And so I think as Jesus followers, I think it's important that we don't keep track of favors.
Yeah.
We are a people who offer grace in the little things and the big.
Well, I think that's a great place to kind of stop and maybe just let on that note. And again, what I like about, especially where we ended off here, is this is kind of more everyday life kind of things. And maybe it's taking some time and stock where we've started keeping track in the idea of favor of like, I'll do this when they do this, and I can't,
or we may have even written somebody off because they never
because you're whatever, you're in the black on the favors and they're in the red, and maybe take that list whether it's physical or just mental and rip it out and continue just to offer grace in those little things, in whatever they might be. And so just take some time with that. And then maybe if there's some big things that you need to show some grace for, we just want to pray for you over this next week for some healing in that, because we know that might not just be as simple as that. We don't want to simplify this. We don't want to trivialize something that happens where you might need to show some grace, but there's some hurt and going on that. We just want to pray for that there's healing in that. And again, grace can be a journey as well as any of the things we talk about, forgiveness and loving your enemy. There's a journey in that. You don't need to get there right away. Let God transform you and heal you and all that. So thank you so much for joining us as we've gone through this series on group identity, thriving in community. We just encourage you to go back and look at other videos and just to, as you look at the different identity things we say, like grace, forgiveness, loving enemies, compassion, kindness, just to reorient yourself and look at stories of Jesus and look at stories who are people in your community that are showing those different traits in everyday stages of life you can see as a model for how you can do that. And I would just encourage you to go back, listen, start to acknowledge, start to see where you're doing in your own life. Thank you so much. Please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.